You cannot appreciate what we're going through if you don't have knowledge or people at the table for consultation. And very often people will make decisions, for example, that may affect small island developing states who constitute a quarter of the world's states without actually knowing the implications. Now, if you have someone at the table, what might be even an innocent decision, but loaded with awful consequences, you can stop ahead of the time, and you need to do it. Why? Because most small states don't have a buffer for error, don't have a buffer for benign neglect. And therefore, changing the rules of the game to allow us to be seen and heard is absolutely critical, particularly given the multiplicity of challenges that we are facing. Most of these countries started without a development compact. They started having been the victims of the extraction of wealth for centuries. It therefore meant that you had undeveloped systems of education, undeveloped systems of healthcare, no housing, very limited capacity in terms of the treasury. And then you all of a sudden ask them to adjust to these multiplicity of global challenges, very little of which they've contributed to, and then say, go and incur more debt. And then when you do it, then you realize that I'm crowding out this fiscal space that I have for education, for healthcare. So we are being, as I've said over and over, victims twice, both in terms of the extraction of wealth for the Industrial Revolution, and then the double jeopardy comes because that same Industrial Revolution has put us on the front line of the climate crisis. Now, when you add to that the fact that the colonial structures and relationships of power were cemented in the context of the international institutions, be it the UN or the IFIs, that's the triple exposure to jeopardy, because it then means that you don't have the capacity to change the trajectory or to change the attitude of these institutions. How is it that quantitative easing is not recommended for countries across the world prior to COVID? But as soon as COVID comes, the G7 countries engage in the most massive exercise in quantitative easing known. How is it that we continue, and President Lula spoke about it yesterday in his address to the General Assembly, I've spoken about it over and over, that Ghana and other countries in Africa are borrowing at multiple rates of what European countries can borrow at, in circumstances where the needs are greater and in circumstances where there is no clear explanation. You can tell me about safe assets and you can give me all the technical language. But when all is said and done, there is a fundamental disparity. How is it that carbon market prices in Guyana are at $6 and $8 a ton, but in Europe in excess of $100 a ton? There is need for a fundamental reset first in terms of the need for equity and the removal of disparity of treatment. Then there is need to come now to the mechanics of how, that's why I asked you how frank do you want me to be.
Frank.
Then there is need to come now to the mechanics of what we must do, because we find ourselves in the world that we have, not the one that we want. So we have seen some improvements, and let us be fair, but the problem is that we're not seeing the speed and the scope of what we need to do. And if you ask me to be diverted, as my own country is, we got hit by Hurricane Beryl. We didn't get the humanitarian disaster that the Grenadines had, or that Carriacou had, but my fishing industry was decimated, 90% of it. All of my beaches on the West Coast affected. All of my jetties and my fishing harbor completely affected. So I now got to find money to fix a harbor, a fishing harbor, and I still have to, because of the circumstances of that harbor, it remains vulnerable, so I've got to build a new one as well. But I can't just go straight to the new one, because the new one needs 18 months of studies before I can do anything. So I've got to repair immediately and plan for building. But that money would have been otherwise spent with the fiscal space that I need to have in areas of healthcare
And education.
or in fighting crime or in building education.
Yeah.
So I give you that example where harsh choices have to be made, and where very often the best made plans are put aside, not because of anything we have done, but because within 72 hours you're told, get yourself ready. God knows what's going to happen in Cuba and Florida with Helen as we speak. And what we're missing is that's just the heart attacks. Let's deal with the chronic NCDs of climate. That's water, drought.
Yeah.
That is wildfires. The other things that are literally decimating the capacity of communities to live. And the big one, and you and I have talked about this in DC,
Yeah.
is the role that the absence of insurance, affordable insurance, will play in completely changing the deal, because the whole financial system is premised on, if I want a mortgage, I need insurance. If I want to borrow from a bank, I need insurance. Well, if you're not underwriting risk for wildfires anymore in California, and you are either increasing the cost of premium or not underwriting risk for hurricanes and floods in certain parts of the US, people will just move to another state. But in my country, and in the other sovereign countries of the Caribbean, where are they going to move to? The reality is that we've seen where the benefits have been. But because some of these benefits have not sufficiently trickled down to the people who need it at the bottom, we have the rise of populism, and let us call it for what it is. The bias against migration is rooted in historic injustices and attitudes. So we need to be able to sell and to explain to people how they benefit. The truth is that a trade war between China and the US just puts the whole world at risk. And that's not in anyone's interest. And at the end of the day, it actually makes it worse for both countries because they still live within a global ecosystem. We have accepted that the scale of nervousness and anxiety means that we will no longer go only for efficient supply chains, but we will go for resilient supply chains. And it's probably going to take another 2 or 3 decades before we turn the corner again back to be able to work in that seamless manner that we do. And I hope and pray that messages like Ngozi Zone will continue to resonate, because that is exactly what the world needs to be able to apply the collective human ingenuity to solving the big problems of the earth related to climate, related to AI. I used to say all the time that if we could send a man to the moon, and if we can spend billions of dollars in trying to solve male baldness, then we surely can be able to find the solution for the climate crisis.